The film business is rough and tumble. It takes a lot of patience as well as making the right moves in order to build a long career. Missteps in the beginning can sometimes derail it. Even James Cameron thinks that he made it out lucky. He thought that, after Piranha 2, his career was over. Thankfully, he had Terminator just around the corner. Not everyone is that lucky though. Sometimes all you get is one shot and you end up squandering it, or perhaps worse, never really living up to it. In this video, I want to take a look at some of the one-hit wonder directors. These are the ones that only ever directed one feature film or only ever directed one notable film. In the latter case, everything before or after was a dud, though oddly, many of these films were critical or commercial successes or both. Many of these are directors that should have gotten another chance, but for whatever reason, either did not or decided not to take the plunge again. Rocky Morton and Annabel Jankel were the directing duo behind the ill-fated Super Mario Bros. Movie in 1993. Made on a budget of as high as $48 million, the film made less than $39 million at the box office and was lambasted by critics, though it has, in the decades since, become a cult classic. Michael Wilmington, writing for the LA Times, noted amusingly that, quote, "It's a movie split in two, wildly accomplished on one level, wildly deficient on another." Morton and Jankel were the creators behind Max Headroom, a 1980s cyberpunk satire in which a network oligarchy rules the world. Max Headroom ended up becoming a cult hit and might be one of the most impactful pop culture and sci-fi events of the 1980s. Its success literally catapulted them across the pond from London to LA, where they were first considered to co-direct Child's Play, though the movie would eventually go to director Tom Holland. Instead, their first film ended up being 1988's DOA, a modest critical and commercial success. Frankly, it's the kind of film that immediately falls in the shadow of something like Super Mario Bros., which they got to work on after DOA. Throughout the 1980s, a lot of producers tried to get a Mario movie made. The Mario Bros. Arcade game was a success, while Super Mario Bros. Pretty much revolutionized the industry, helping revive the gaming market after a crash a few years prior. Roland Joff, who directed 1984's The Killing Fields, a film about the Khmer Rouge that's now considered one of the best films of all time, was the one who convinced Nintendo to let him do a live-action adaptation. I mentioned The Killing Fields specifically because I think it's wild that both of these movies came from the same mind. According to Joff, Nintendo was quite hands-off. In his words, quote, "I think they looked at the movie as some sort of strange creature that was kind of rather intriguing to see if we could walk or not," end quote. Barry Morrow took the first crack at the screenplay, which ended up more of a serious drama than a comedy. Over the years, several other writers and directors were considered, including Harold Ramis, who later said that passing on the movie was the smartest career move he ever made. Joff eventually landed on Morton and Jankel thanks to Max Headroom. The trio decided that they wanted to go in a more darker direction, similar to how 1989's Batman and 1990's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles turned out. It does point to a fundamental lack of understanding of what kind of game Super Mario Bros. Is. It makes sense, then, that pre-production was fraught, as there were many competing visions on what the movie should turn out like. Morton and Jankel felt the project slipping away from them, but they decided to stay on, hoping that they could eventually reclaim their vision, though that was not meant to be. The script was being rewritten as it was being casted, and even more rewrites were necessary when Disney came on to distribute via Buena Vista Pictures. In the end, the inability to get a workable story would come back to bite them. While the movie got praise for its visual effects, it was lambasted for everything else. Both continued directing, mostly music videos, commercials, and TV, though Jankel took another crack at directing features with 2018's Tell It to the Bees. Her next feature is a World War II film set in Paris, so she might not be a one-hit filmic wonder for much longer. Bill Murray has had a long, successful career in film and television. He got his start in the 70s with SNL and was a huge hit in comedies throughout the 80s, with 1984's Ghostbusters being his highest-grossing film so far. In the late 80s, he got to work co-directing 1990's Quick Change with Howard Franklin. The movie is a crime comedy adapted from 1981's Quick Change by Jake Cronley. Murray, who also acted in it, plays Grim, a down-on-his-luck fella who decides to dress up like a clown and rob a bank in Midtown Manhattan. The heist actually ends up being easier than the getaway, which turns out to be an amusing Rube Goldberg machine of hijinks that conspires to thwart his criminal success. Now, this isn't a movie that Murray necessarily wanted to direct. He intended to just act in it, and he and Franklin wanted somebody else to direct. Jonathan Demme was the first choice, but they had availability issues. Then they asked Ron Howard, but he turned it down after reading the script. They approached other directors as well, but they would disagree on who was suitable. Eventually, they decided to just do it themselves. That is to say, then, that Bill Murray is a one-hit wonder director by choice. The movie ended up getting pretty good reviews, with some calling it Murray's best film role. Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus reads, quote, "Quick Change makes the most of its clever premise with a smartly skewed heist comedy that leaves plenty of room for its talented cast to shine," end quote. Alas, it ended up flopping at the box office. Howard Franklin had a couple more flops, so he stuck with writing, while Murray, of course, continued to have a very successful acting career. Paul Brickman is not a one-hit wonder in the traditional sense. He's directed 3 movies, 1983's Risky Business, 1990's Men Don't Leave, and 2012's Allison. Rather, he's a one-hit wonder director in the vein of Richard Kelly. Richard Kelly directed 2001's Donnie Darko, 2006's Southland Tales, and 2009's The Box, but of them, Donnie Darko is his best known and most successful work. After that, it was as though Kelly ran right into a brick wall and was unable to get any more movies made. Paul Brickman is pretty much the same deal, down to the fact that it's his first movie, Risky Business, that everyone knows him for. Brickman got his start writing and got a chance to direct Risky Business, starring Tom Cruise, in his early 30s. It's kind of wild how differently their careers turned out. The movie propelled Cruise into becoming the leading man of the 1980s and made him an international superstar. Cruise reveled in the fame and fortune. Brickman, however, did not. Actually, he seemed to hate the pomp and circumstance that came with having one of the best films of 1983 that was also a commercial hit, 10xing its budget. But, in Brickman's words, quote, "The success of Risky Business was strange, because I had Hollywood coming at me full throttle. I moved out of LA immediately. Studio heads sent me wine goblets and food baskets, and people threw material at me left and right and lined up to meet me. It gets uncomfortable. Some people like the visibility, I don't. I'm more from the J.D. Salinger school," end quote. Unfortunately, Brickman also seemed to regret his decision to not strike when the iron was hot. His next film came out 7 years after Risky Business to mixed critical reviews, and it was a dud at the box office. He turned down offers for Rain Man and Forrest Gump, which would have been lucrative. In his words, quote, "I squandered a really good career. What can I say?" end quote. Ryan Gosling is an up-and-coming actor who's been in a few cult hits like 2024's The Fall Guy, 2023's Barbie, and 2017's Blade Runner 2049. But a decade ago, before he had his biggest hits, he also took a crack at directing a movie, 2015's Lost River. The attempt did not go over well. A fantasy thriller, it was written, directed, and produced by Gosling, who stayed behind the scenes. It stars Christina Hendricks trying to bring up a couple of kids in a rundown city and entering a seedy lifestyle to do so. Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus is quite tepid, reading, quote, "Lost River suggests that debuting writer-director Ryan Gosling may have a bright future as a filmmaker, but it doesn't hold together well enough to recommend on its own merit," end quote. Peter Bradshaw, writing for The Guardian, is willing to be a bit harsher, saying that the movie is, quote, "colossally indulgent, shapeless, often fantastically and unthinkingly offensive, and at all times insufferably conceited," end quote. The movie, basically, was trying too hard to be something that it wasn't, as was perhaps Ryan Gosling. At the very least, it seems that the experience left a bad taste in his mouth. He hasn't directed a film since. 1992's Man Bites Dog is a French black comedy mockumentary with 3 directors, Rémy Belvaux, André Bonzel, and Benoît Poelvoorde, all of whom acted in the film. It's about some filmmakers that tag along with Ben, an affable serial killer that has the interests of a Renaissance man. They record him committing multiple murders, and as the film continues, they get more and more involved with predictable results. If you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend it. The movie, shot in black and white, was made on as low of a budget as they could muster, casting family and friends to fill out the rest of the meager cast. On its release, the film was castigated for its violence, getting banned in some countries and being refused certification in others, which limited how it could be advertised. Still, the movie managed to make an impressive $3.5 million on a tiny $33,000 budget, thanks to edits in some territories that cut out the worst offenses. Kenneth Turn, running for the LA Times, had high praise for the movie, noting, quote, "Man Bites Dog defines audacity, an assured seductive chamber of horrors. It marries nightmare with humor and then abruptly takes the laughter away. Intentionally disturbing, it is close to the last word about the nature of violence on film, a troubling, often funny vision of what the movies have done to our souls," end quote. In what can only be described as ironic considering the movie is a commentary on the human enjoyment for violence, Quentin Tarantino got into a fight with half a dozen security guards when they wouldn't let him into a screening of the movie at Cannes. Alas, it ended up being the only notable directorial outing for the three directors. Poelvoorde has gone on to have a long acting career in France, while Bonzel has done some other work as a director and cinematographer. Belvaux, who once threw a cream pie at Bill Gates in 1998, unfortunately took his own life in 2006. Gary Oldman is one of the greatest actors of our time. Here's a guy that sometimes gets so lost in his role, as well as under more makeup than a human being should be expected to bear, that I will sometimes catch myself saying, "Holy crap, that's Gary Oldman." He's one of those guys that you're always pleasantly surprised to see on the big screen. And, as though proof that if God exists, they have favorites, Gary Oldman wrote, produced, and directed one movie that's considered to be one of the best British movies ever made. That was 1997's Nil by Mouth, a drama centered on a dysfunctional family in London. It stars Raymond Winstone as Ray and Kathy Burke as Val, a couple with a tempestuous relationship stemming from Ray's violent temper, which causes her to miscarry. The film, notable for its copious use of swearing, was not based on Gary Oldman's upbringing. In fact, he was quite emphatic about that in a 2014 Playboy interview, saying, quote, "That character is not my dad. My mother never got beat up. That character was a composite, partly fiction and partly a kid I knew at school. It's not my personal story, but that's what the media wanted. Sorry, I get a little angry about these things," end quote. The film, while a failure at the box office, was a hit with critics and was even nominated for a Palme d'Or at Cannes. In 2017, Time Out magazine polled 150 film industry professionals, who ranked Nil by Mouth as the 21st best British film ever made. In the same Playboy interview, you do get a sense that Gary Oldman wants to direct another movie. He noted that he had a script that he wrote, Flying Horse, but that, even after movies like the Dark Knight trilogy and Harry Potter, he could not get the funding that he needed. In his words, quote, "It's been nearly 2 years trying to get money. I have my cast pretty much, but the funding isn't there. Partly, it's the subject. If it had zombies and Leonardo DiCaprio in it, people would be falling over me," end quote. Getting studios to part with their money is, of course, the hardest thing to do in Hollywood. I hope that he's able to do it again. Hironobu Sakaguchi is someone that I've talked about before, but his case is so emblematic of a one-hit wonder film director that it's difficult not to include him. Now, Sakaguchi is an extremely talented individual. The guy helped create Final Fantasy at Square back in the 80s, and served as director or producer on every Final Fantasy game up through 7. 1997's Final Fantasy VII, of course, was a massive critical and commercial success. Not only did it help revitalize Square, it also helped boost PlayStation sales around the world. It's one of those games that bring an entire generation of gamers into the fold. Sakaguchi, reasonably, was riding pretty high. Unfortunately, his next move was not another game, but a movie. 2001's The Spirits Within was a massive drain on resources. To put it in perspective, Final Fantasy VII cost around $80 million to make all in. That means development and marketing. The Spirits Within, meanwhile, had a $137 million budget just for its production. Marketing costs probably pushed that over $200 million. Considering it made just $85 million at the box office, it's hard to call it anything but a bomb. But Sakaguchi does deserve plenty of praise for the sheer ambition of the movie. Most movie bombs are not ambitious. They don't try to do anything new. I like movies like Green Lantern, The Lone Ranger, and John Carter, all of which bomb. And while The Lone Ranger has some of the best action scenes you'll ever see in a movie, none of those films ever try to push the envelope. None of them took big swings or put their multi-$100 million budgets to good use to try and push film technology into a new era. Sakaguchi and The Spirits Within did. It was a huge leap forward in what was possible with animated films. Sakaguchi embarked on a path that wanted to remove the barrier between what looked animated and what looked like real life. The Spirits Within was the first serious attempt at bringing photorealistic animation to the big screen for extended periods of time, something that Disney would perfect with 2019's The Lion King. Basically, it was a giant tech demo. Films like Beowulf and The Polar Express would try to replicate it, but all of these movies continually ran into the same issue, namely the uncanny valley, or that point where something looks just human, but it's different enough that something about it looks off. The Spirits Within was a complex film. John Edgar Park, writing for Animation World in 2001, said that, quote, "The film itself is composed of 1,327 shots. There are 141,964 frames, each of which took anywhere from 15 minutes to over 7 hours per frame to render. The average was around 90 minutes. Square Pictures stored 10 terabytes of 3D and 5 terabytes of 2D artwork. The roughly 200 people who worked on the film contributed about 100 person-years of work." End quote. Sakaguchi also ran into the usual headwinds. First, making a game and a movie are two different things, and while success in the one does not guarantee that it will transfer over to the other. And second, video game movies also weren't a billion-dollar business then that they are now. The movie led to Sakaguchi leaving Square and spending some years depressed and demoralized before he picked himself back up and started his own video game studio, Mistwalker. Still, The Spirits Within is a historically significant movie, and if you're going to bomb, go big or go home. The Spirits Within was a bomb, yes, and Hironobu Sakaguchi never made another movie again, but the man went big and he helped change minds about what could be done with animation. Plenty of people, like Roger Ebert, recognized it for the brilliant milestone that it is. In his enthusiastic 3.5 out of 4-star review, Ebert said that he was, quote, "torn between its craft elements and its story. The story is nuts and bolts space opera without the intelligence and daring of, say, Steven Spielberg's AI. But the look of the film is revolutionary. Final Fantasy is a technical milestone like the first talkies or 3D movies. You want to see it whether you care about aliens or space cannons. It exists in a category of its own, the first citizen of the new world of cyberfilm." End quote. Keanu Reeves has had one hell of a career that's going on 40 years now. It's had its ups and downs, but it's probably not wrong to say that between the Matrix movies and the John Wick series, that Reeves is one of the action icons of our time. Given these two series, as well as movies like 47 Ronin, it's plain as day that Reeves enjoys martial arts. It makes sense, then, that the one movie that he's directed, 2013's Man of Tai Chi, is a martial arts film. Released the same year as the critically panned and commercially crushed 47 Ronin, Man of Tai Chi, while not making money, did manage to earn some decent reviews. Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus put it well, quote, "It may not be groundbreaking, but Man of Tai Chi represents an agreeably old-fashioned picture for martial arts fans, and a solid debut for first-time director Keanu Reeves." End quote. The movie stars Tiger Chen, who needs to raise a bunch of money in order to rescue a Tai Chi temple. He does so by agreeing to participate in underground fights for Keanu Reeves' character, who decides to take on a villainous turn for this movie. The plot has some predictabilities, but, as Robert Abel wrote for the LA Times, it manages to, quote, "evoke the timeless zip of martial arts movies past," end quote. According to Reeves, the first day of directing was the most difficult, but he soon eased into it. He noted that, as an actor, he usually just had to do a scene and then he could go to his trailer. But, as director, he was the one that everyone had questions for. In his words, quote, "You're kind of wearing two hats, two perspectives. And so for me to jump from one to the other, I don't have any experience for that," end quote. Still, he handled it like a champ. Whether or not he'll direct another movie is uncertain, but he certainly proved that he's more than capable. Joseph Gordon-Levitt has had an interesting career and kind of reminds me of Christian Bale. Both started off as acclaimed child actors before transitioning to doing adult roles, though remaining mostly independent. But whereas Bale has continued with acting his entire life, Gordon-Levitt seems to prefer to indulge his interests more. For one, he took a detour through Columbia University, though he did drop out to continue acting. He's had some great films, like 2005's Brick and 2012's Looper with Rian Johnson, 2010's Inception and 2012's The Dark Knight Rises with Christopher Nolan, and 2012's Lincoln with Steven Spielberg. During that period of time, he also found time to write, direct, and star in 2013's Don John, a critical and commercial hit. In it, Gordon-Levitt plays a porn addict whose habits start having deleterious effects on his life. The most unbelievable part of the movie is the fact that he manages to hook up with Scarlett Johansson and still prefers porn, though, to be fair, her character does want him to change in ways that he doesn't want to. Gordon-Levitt got advice on directing from Rian Johnson, who, whatever you might think of The Last Jedi, is an excellent director, as well as Christopher Nolan. Johnson provided feedback on the script and watched different cuts of the movie, while Nolan advised that Gordon-Levitt either star or direct, but should proceed with caution if he wanted to do both. He had directed several shorts prior for his company, Hit Record, so it's not like he was going in completely blind, but, of course, directing a feature and a short are wildly different. Nonetheless, I think he did a good job. It would be a while before he decided to direct again, though it wouldn't be for a feature film. He got behind and in front of the camera again for Mr. Corman and Apple TV Plus show. He's back to acting now, though I'm curious to see if he'll direct another movie. Directing is difficult work. we'll look at movies and see the glitz and glamour, though directing a movie is something like being the captain of a ship, a slow and very expensive vehicle. It's a case where success has many fathers, but failure only has one, and that one is the director. In the best of the worst case, you do it once, decide it's not for you, and stick with acting or writing or producing. In the worst of the worst cases, it frays your nerves and your subsequent attempts never really live up to your first or best. That said, I have tremendous respect for the directors that have only ever directed even just a single movie. I'm reminded of Theodore Roosevelt's Man in the Arena speech, wherein he says, quote, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena," end quote. I hope that, for those who've done just a single film or a single notable film and are still with us, that they re-entered the arena. And if you're considering making a film, I hope that you also decide to enter the arena.